Our system is characterized by a power to the powerful dynamic, and it's escalating. And this is where resources and decision-making rights, and even the right to define reality as people understand it, those are being channeled more and more toward those who already have power. And I refer to this as the dragon political economy. It's the structure of the system that has this power to the powerful dynamic. And to understand it, we need to understand game theory. Now, usually when you first start to learn game theory, you learn about the prisoner's dilemma, where they have these two prisoners that are trying to decide should they rat each other out or not. You learn about the battle of the sexes, where you have a romantic couple deciding what to do on the weekend. But you notice these games have certain properties. They have a symmetric element to them, where the two players have equal roles in the system. And they're also isolated from their context. In both of these cases, the players in the game are going to have other games in their lives, and that little decision about what to do over the weekend or whether to rat out your friend is really embedded in a bigger context of games. It's something that I call the tapestry of game theory, which is all of the games woven together. And so to understand the game theory of the dragon political economy, we're actually going to have to zoom back to understand the game of games. And one of the things going on here is going to be the notion of game switching. And here's what I mean by that. You might imagine a group of kids who are playing a board game with each other. And maybe the dynamic gets a little bit out of hand and they're kind of being a little too mean to one of their friends in the game. That friend might say, you know what, I'm done. I'm not playing this game of Monopoly, this board game. And that is that friend sort of rejecting the game they're playing and moving to a higher level, which is the game of their overall friendship. The game of their friendship is a repeated game, a never-ending game. It's a game where it's not just this board game, but it's also them playing soccer together and them passing notes at the school table, at the lunch table at school. There's a whole bunch of different games that are sort of woven under the game of their friendship. And so moving between games is something that happens a lot in the whole system. And this switching between games happens a lot in our system. And in fact, it's where a lot of the strategic action takes place. So when we consider power to the powerful, we need to acknowledge that there's different types of power. There's money power and technology power, administrative power, military power, media power, and all of those types of power sort of have their own way of playing the game around them. Consider a large corporation who's competing within their industry. And that large corporation might decide, oh, what if I cooperated with another large corporation in the industry to pool our resources and collude to lobby a government regulatory body. And maybe that regulatory agency, what they're lobbying for is to impose safety regulations that make it difficult for small businesses to compete with those large players in the industry. That's an example of taking money power and translating it into administrative power. It's an example of game switching between the game of the industry and the game that goes on between corporations and regulatory bodies. And that translation is going to come back and affect these small businesses trying to compete, perhaps to knock them out of the industry in a strategic move by the colluding corporations. Tech corporations might take technology power and translate it into media power by adjusting their social media algorithms to upregulate and downregulate selectively according to their goals. And of course, if they take the ability to do that and sell the rights to influence upregulation and downregulation to somebody else, then that's translating the media power into money power. So you kind of see how the strategic switching between different types of power and different games is actually the way many players operate who are operating on top of the system. And that's going to be super important in understanding the nature of this power to the powerful dynamic. So where am I going in this video? And basically, I want to answer two questions. One is, what does it mean to have power in our system? Because if we don't have a grasp on that, we will not understand power to the powerful. And then second, what is game theory? And then finally, what can people who are aware of this dynamic do to rechannel the power to the powerful dynamic towards something that's way healthier than the dragon political economy? So what does it mean to have power? And I'm going to give a couple of different definitions, and here's why. When we think about the game of games and the game switching that strategic actors will play in this game, the more flexible you are in terms of moving between games and moving between different ways of thinking about the world, the better you will be able to play the game of games. So anytime somebody is too rigid in their thinking, they're too stuck on a single definition of how things work, then somebody can act strategically against that. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the public discourse, the rhetoric, especially around economics, but around a whole lot of topics, is actually part of the strategic landscape in the game of games. And it's a really important part of the strategic landscape. So to build a powerful strategic strategy in that space, a person needs to have multiple definitions as a way of being flexible. So who has power in the system? Definition number one, a person has power if they are networked around node clusters where collective decisions get made. And when I say collective decisions, it's things about the society we live in where you're kind of like, who gets to make that decision? Who gets to decide what gets upregulated and downregulated on social media? Who gets to decide what kinds of pesticides are allowed that end up in my Cheerios and that end up destroying ecosystems? Who gets to decide what is covered and not covered by Medicare? And I'm not going to fully unpack this definition in this video, but this definition evokes a network model of the system, and that's one way to visualize the system. It's not the only way. As a matter of fact, our second definition of what it means to have power is going to use a more hierarchical model. And to envision this one, we might start with an organizational chart in a corporation with the CEO and the C-suite executives and middle management and workers at the bottom. Except when you're mapping that onto society, there's no official organizational structure. It's more like clusters of people who are closer to nodes where collective decisions get made. So I think of it more as a bubble cluster visualization of the hierarchy of our system. So with that visualization, the second definition of who has power in the system is a person has power if they can define the rules of the game for other people. And to understand this, I would divide game theory into horizontal and vertical game theory, where the classic games, Prisoner's Dilemma, Battle of the Sexes, Game of Chicken, etc., those are horizontal games because the players in the game have roughly equal status and they're working under the same set of rules to play the game with each other. Whereas vertical game theory is really the game of defining the rules of the game that other people will operate within. And of course, the corporation, the C-suite executives, they define the rules of the game in terms of salary structure and mission of the organization and frequency of meetings, all of that. They determine the rules of the game for the workers. And in economics, the technical terms for vertical game theory are going to be principal agent modeling or mechanism design. And this includes the government structuring the rules for firms to operate and compete within underneath the umbrella of those rules. It includes a college like mine that distributes the right to me to define the rules of my classroom and my syllabus. And I will say, as you advance in economics, the boundary between vertical and horizontal game theory will kind of fray at the edges. So for example, voters and congresspeople, which of those defines the rules of the game for the other? And on one hand, the congressperson definitely defines a lot of the rules of the game, or collectively with other congresspeople, defines the rules of the game that the people live within as they move about their lives. But you could also say the game that the congresspeople are playing is collectively determined by the voters. Where do they go for their information? What kinds of podcasts or news outlets do they go to get ready to vote? All of that. Now, if we want to understand the game theory of power to the powerful, what is game theory? And I'm kind of in a dilemma as somebody teaching game theory because the public discourse is a strategic space, and it has evolved in a way that serves the power to the powerful dynamic. So the way we conceptualize game theory and economics has these distortions, and as someone teaching it, I have to act against those distortions to re-empower people who would rather not have this dragon political economy, who would rather redirect the dynamic of the system towards something healthier. Because of that, I'm going to give you 3 definitions of game theory. Once again, we're going for flexible thinking, and these definitions might differ from what you've heard before, but I've taught game theory for 14 years, and I'm confident in these definitions. And as we go through these 3 definitions, I'll point out how it relates to power to the powerful. Definition number 1, game theory is the study of relational dynamics. And here, if we look at the classic games you first learn in game theory, Prisoner's Dilemma, Battle of the Sexes, Game of Chicken, Assurance Game, Zero-Sum Game. The way to think about those games is that they're archetypes of relational dynamics. And I use the word archetype here intentionally. So if you study storytelling, there's going to be archetypes of characters in the hero's journey story. You've got the hero, you've got the shadow, you've got the trickster, you've got the threshold guardian, the mentor, the ally. And when you look at different stories, those characters show up in very, very different forms in different stories. So you're not trying to come up with exactly what does the ally or what does the trickster do at each point in the story. You're incredibly flexible in the way you look for these different character archetypes as you study storytelling and the hero's journey. And similarly, when we learn game theory, sometimes we look at the way it's first presented in these matrices with these numbers, and it seems like this static thing on the page. It seems like we're learning a map, but we do not have to mistake the map for the territory. And as a matter of fact, the map is pointing to something that's dynamic, that's moving. It's a relational archetype that manifests in many, many different ways. You watch children playing on the playground, and you'll see game theory. You read a Jane Austen novel and you'll see game theory, and it looks very different in these places, but there's still relational dynamics. How does this definition help us to understand the power to the powerful dragon political economy? And basically, we need to think of this as a moving system. We need to think of the system as being built on top of many, many relationships, each of which has its own moving dynamic that is not stable and fixed, but rather that has this inherent instability in the relationship that can potentially be disrupted. And strategic actors are going to, when they're moving between the game of games, they are going to come in and disrupt those dynamic relationships between people. Definition number 2. Game theory is the study of the way people live out their values in context with other people, intuiting and taking into account those other people's values and drives and likely responses to their behavior. Now, you notice this definition avoids the word strategy or strategic behavior, which might seem weird because other definitions of game theory oftentimes focus on the notion of strategy. So what am I doing with this? And I'm trying to avoid common misconceptions about how game theory works. So in the universal monoculture, when people use the word strategic behavior, there's this connotation that it's conniving and self-seeking. And that is absolutely not the way it works in game theory. So to think about this, we might even remember that game theory includes not just economics, game theory in human realms, but also evolutionary biology, game theory in the animal world, frogs and pelicans and fruit flies and moose. Those animals engage in game theory sorts of behavior, and in fact, that's how you think about the evolution of ecosystems, is through game theory around those animals. And a typical strategy in the animal realm might be thinking of birds as either being aggressive or being nice. So ways of being in the world, including being nice, being is kind of a general thing. It's not a specific behavior, but something that emerges out of you, and the same is true in the human realm. Now, we run up against this problem when we move from the animal realm to the human realm of game theory, which is there's something in our brains that wants to automatically categorize everything as either good or evil. And in game theory with humans and economics, it's pretty important to resist that impulse. And to think through why, an example that helps me is the mama bear example. We know there's both human versions of mama bear and bear and her cubs versions of mama bear. And the human versions actually do have good and evil. We've probably all seen cases where a human mama bear advocates for her kid to get the lead role in the school play up against the rights of other children. And yet we've also seen really beautiful versions of the human version of mama bear where she's protecting her kids from being bullied or taken advantage of. And there's this principle at play that I will not fully flesh out in this video, but it basically goes like this. The model itself is not the right place to determine good and evil. As a matter of fact, a lot of the banality of evil in our system right now comes from people determining good and evil in their model, projecting it onto the real world with no room for being wrong. And because of that, a mature understanding of game theory requires this ambiguity around good and evil that might be hard to understand unless you've seen a whole bunch of examples that I'm not going to go through right now in this video, but it might make a little more sense when I flesh out cooperation and competition in a second. And I've tried to build that ambiguity into this definition of game theory by my use of the word values. So values can be a person, I value a Lamborghini for raising my status. Or it can be, I value truth and honesty and courage and goodness. It can be, I value living in harmony with other people. It could be, I value protecting the rights of my family, like with Mama Bear. It could be, I value spreading my religion. So values is an ambiguous term in terms of good and evil, and my hope is that you're beginning to think of it that way as you're building up a mature understanding of game theory. But why does all of this matter for the power to the powerful dragon political economy? And if you imagine a bubble cluster hierarchical model of our system, we kind of all know that sociopaths are more likely to move up into these roles of power. Of course, to do that successfully, they have to be pretty good at pretending to be cooperative, pretending to share the values of people around them. And yet those sociopaths are operating on systems with good people who are doing their best to live out good values as they move into these roles of power. So if you're trying to understand the game of games and everything that doesn't fit into a conniving, self-seeking model of what's going on becomes invisible to you, you will not be able to see or conceptualize the system. And if that system becomes invisible to you, that gives strategic advantage to those who can properly think about the whole system. A sociopath who has a deep and flexible understanding of game theory is way more dangerous than a sociopath who only thinks game theory is about conniving, self-seeking behavior. Definition number 3. Game theory is the study of the way competition and cooperation are intertwined. And if this seems weird to you, I'm going to give you 4 ways this can happen, starting with cooperating on behalf of an in-group at the expense of an out-group, or competing with an out-group. And actually, Mama Bear is a good example of this one. Mama Bear is altruistic and cooperative toward her family in competition or potentially at the expense of the rest of the world. An activist is altruistic and cooperative toward their in-group at the expense of those who might oppose their value, or those who might have competing values or be negatively impacted by whatever activist strategy they're using. You can see how the competition and cooperation, they're both at play at the same time. Now, how does that relate to the dragon political economy? And to see that, we might turn to a classic manifestation of the prisoner's dilemma, which is 2 firms deciding, do we collude with each other and keep prices high, or do we compete with each other and undercut the prices? And if those firms decide to cooperate, to collude with each other, that's at the expense of the rest of the world, essentially. And if we turn to our bubble cluster hierarchy model of the system, we can evoke a concept called the technostructure from Kenneth Galbriath, this famous economist that I've sometimes talked about on this channel. And the basic idea with the technostructure is that it's this networked collaboration between the corporate sector and the government sector, where there's social relationships across those entities. And one reason I find the bubble cluster model to be really useful is because the in-group, out-group dynamics are actually going to play a really big role in the game theory. And one thing I do a lot in my economic thinking is to think about the system from different perspectives, because some things that are really apparent from one viewpoint in the system become completely invisible from another viewpoint. And one thing that's true about the in-group is we tend to think about the in-group as being altruistic, whereas we tend to think of the out-group as being selfish. And this will apply from the perspective of the technostructure. From inside the technostructure, people are living out their values that they share with other people in similar positions. They have the mission of the corporation or the mission of the government agency that they're trying to live out. So things might look really altruistic from inside that. Whereas somebody looking at it from the outside, seeing what is this system doing, it's doing something that seems incredibly blind and selfish, and yet that's also missing part of the story that's only visible from the inside of the technostructure. A second way that competition and cooperation can be intertwined is when you compete with an in-group under a set of rules that are collaboratively upheld. So here, a classic example might be a soccer league. You're competing with others in the soccer league. Of course, there's still an in-group cooperating with your in-group, your team, competing against the out-group, the other team. But that competition happens under the rules of the league, and everybody is collectively making sure everybody in the league upholds those rules. And this is actually why I'm so focused on the economic mythology. Because the system we live under is upheld through an economic mythology. This is what people perceive to be legitimate and illegitimate economic behavior that is collectively upheld by everybody. And it's those rules of the highest layer institutions, the highest layer games, that are upheld in people's minds, distributed across people's minds. And all of the competition, business competition, sexual competition, friendship competition, competition between religions or values, all of that takes place underneath a set of rules that will determine which players win, which groups expand and grow their influence, which groups have difficulty gaining traction and contract in the system. Third, competitive and cooperative motives can be at play in the same individual at the same time, driving the same behavior. So here we might think of donating to a charity. There's a very cooperative drive and motivation behind that, which is this blood drive organization you're donating to. You want to expand its capacity. It's cooperative between you and them. But there can also be selfish motives at the same time. Maybe you also want to be raised in the status of your friends, and if they know that you do that, your status will go up. And the way this plays in with Power to the Powerful is that strategic actors designing the games for people below them in the system, they know this. If they're smart, they know this. If there's a conflict between people, between what they're being paid to do, perhaps a selfish motive, and a more cooperative motive, their values, those people are not going to have the full energy to devote to whatever cause they're hired to do. So it's important to align people's selfish motives, their money-based motives, with their values, their cooperative altruistic motives. When those two things are aligned, you get the full force of somebody's creative energy. And strategic designers of a system know that. So what that means is that there is going to be strategic acting on the moral frame, on people's values, people's perception of values, people's perception of what their community perceives to be socially cooperative. And this is why the public discourse has become such a strategic environment. If game theory is living out your values, and your values are shaped by your social environment, and that social environment is acted upon by people at a higher layer in a system, perhaps in ways that are imperceptible or subtle, then the very water we swim in of the values we're trying to live out can actually be feeding the power to the powerful dynamic. Now, if that seems cynical to you, it's actually not. And the fact that it seems cynical, I think, is a result of our culture's either-or thinking. So we might imagine a spectrum, where on one extreme end of the spectrum, we have the belief that all values come out of this deep, spiritual being in touch with the world and being in touch with truth and beauty and meaning and God and all of that stuff. That's one belief, is that anytime somebody upholds a value, it's coming from that place. And the other end of the spectrum is that all of society's values are determined by power actors structuring the moral frame according to their needs. And the reality comes from a mixture of both of those. It's somewhere in between. And in fact, both of those extremes are incredibly naive. Fourth, a game can be competitive at an individual game level, but when you zoom back and look at a repeated game, it suddenly becomes cooperative. And Battle of the Sexes is a classic example here. What do we do this weekend? Ballet or football? There's a bit of a competitive element in that one individual decision. But in the context of the relationship, where you decide this every weekend, there's a cooperative solution, which is you decide this week, I'll decide next week, and the back and forth between that is this beautiful dynamic. And both of those are Battle of the Sexes games. It's just one's zoomed into one game, the other zoomed back to the repeated game. This also relates to our kids playing the Monopoly game, the board game, where there's the competitive game they're playing and the cooperative game of their friendship. So this goes back to the notion of game switching, that a mature economic thinker is going to be able to move flexibly between the different games, being aware that competition and cooperation are combined differently at different levels that you could zoom in and zoom out for. Now, people who study game theory closely are going to discover that cooperation is actually more powerful than competition. And if you want a book on this, The Evolution of Cooperation by Robert Axelrod is a really good book that shows some of that story. But I will point out that just because something is more powerful does not mean it is good. In fact, our colluding firms, that's cooperation. They're using the more powerful force, but it's bad for society. And of course, cooperation among people with power at the expense of those without it is not going to be good. And one of the biggest forces behind power to the powerful in our system is the fact that sometimes it's easier to cooperate when you already have power. You have something to bring to the negotiation table, so people who already have power can facilitate more cooperation. And potentially cooperation sort of at the bottom layers of the system can be thwarted strategically in some ways. For example, if people are afraid to protest, that's thwarting thwarting at the lower levels. If people at the lower levels of the system view each other as enemies, in other words, polarization, that's thwarting cooperation from the lower layers of the system. If the only spaces that people can gather to engage in cooperation and collective action are spaces that are owned by digital platforms that inherently serve power to the powerful, that's another force against cooperation at the lower layers of the system. And yet, the key to turning around the power to the powerful dynamic is going to be to tip the balances of these scales, such that cooperation is actually easier and more validated and more strongly upheld in the lower layers of the system than it is from positions of power. So what can we do about it? And the first thing is that we can cultivate cooperative relationships. As we saw, the fact that cooperation is easier from more powerful positions in society, that's one of the forces driving the dynamic. We can turn that around by strengthening cooperation among the lower layers of the system where there are many, many more people. And the cooperation needed with the lower layers needs to be both horizontal with other people on those lower layers, but there also needs to be a vertical cooperation between people who have some power and those without it. Second, understand that the rhetorical landscape is strategic. So the ways we've come to think about how our economic system works, what's valid and invalid activity, what's the moral frame, what are the relevant in-groups and out-groups, all of those things that emerge through the public discourse, there are distortions built into how we think. And getting out from under those distortions will be part of the game in turning the power to the powerful dynamic around. Third, be flexible in reframing enemies as potential collaborators. Because a lot of the game theory around in-groups and out-groups and polarization is to sort of keep people who should be collaborating divided and perceiving each other as enemies. And if those perceptions can be weakened in some ways to recognize, wait a second, there are things in the system that are hurting us all and we could work together to fix them, that sort of turns the competition element that's at the bottom of the system into something that could be collaborative to work against power to the powerful. Fourth, understand the game and your place in it, and understand that there will be things that will be visible from other parts of the system that are not visible to you. And some of those things, some of those realities might have to do with the actions or the behavior of groups or organizations that you are participating in. It might seem like you're participating in something that is wholly good, but people from the outside can actually see things that are intentionally kept invisible to those from the inside. Fifth, cultivate skills. And here we're talking about leadership skills and programming skills and farming skills, governance skills, like getting involved in local governance to figure out how does this work. Because one of the reasons collaboration is easier from higher layers, more powerful places in the system, is because that's where a lot of those skills are concentrated. Good leaders are identified and pulled into the fold in those powerful spots. Computer programmers, sometimes the only place where they have access to large data sets that you would need to develop certain skills, are from inside these tech companies. And so if people who see this problem intentionally cultivate those skills, then they will be better positioned to collaborate. Sixth, cultivate virtue, honesty, integrity, and ability to speak the truth, courage, kindness, diligence. There is a real power in having those skills of integrity, and those require practice, even though you can't go about building virtue with the intention of just doing it to gain power. That makes it not virtue. But it can be kind of heartening that knowing that if you invest in these skills and practice courage, practice speaking the truth, that can actually manifest against power to the powerful. And finally, be ready for a moment when the ability to cooperate with others opens up. Be looking for and ready for that opportunity. Because sometimes I think people mistakenly want to take action right now. They want to protest now or take action against the system right now. And the problem with that is that people wake up to things at different times. So if everybody takes action in the moment when they personally wake up, that's going to be a weak force. Whereas if people are willing to hold off, develop some skills, develop relationships, do all these other things I've suggested with an eye toward when is the right moment, then you can actually exert force in the moment when it could make a difference. There's this time element to cooperation and coordination, and having the patience and the fortitude to watch and wait and to be ready for that moment when something could change, something could shift, and something different could manifest. I really do think that could be the key to turning the tables on power to the powerful.